Blake Randolph had never imagined his small property on the outskirts of Clear Ridge County would one day become the center of a territorial dispute worth millions. To him, it was just land, a stretch of uneven hills, an old red barn that his father once used for weather equipment, and a thin gravel road that wound down toward the main highway. The place wasn't beautiful by suburban standards. It wasn't manicured or symmetrical or framed by imported pines like the neighboring estates that had started appearing over the last decade. But it was honest. He'd bought the property from his uncle 12 years ago and had spent most of his time maintaining the barn, running atmospheric tests for a small research program at the local university, and keeping to himself. It was quiet work, and Blake liked it that way. Most days, the wind was his only company, brushing through the tall grass that grew wild across the western slope. On clear mornings, when the sun climbed over the ridge, he could see the faint shimmer of the new golf course that had spread across the valley like a green carpet, neatly cut, perfectly engineered, and painfully artificial. The HOA that managed the development behind the course called it Panorama Estates, as if the entire horizon belonged to them. When the first letter arrived, Blake barely gave it a glance. A cream-colored envelope with gold lettering, folded with corporate precision, the kind of correspondence that usually went straight into the recycling bin. He assumed it was another promotional invitation, maybe a polite request to attend some community meeting. Only after the second letter came, thicker and stamped with the words, "Notice of Violation," did he actually read it. The document, written in the dense, passive tone of legalese, claimed that his barn significantly obstructed the visual integrity of the western overlook of the golf club's 18th hole. The HOA demanded he either relocate or dismantle the structure within 30 days. Blake laughed at first. The barn had been there long before the golf course, long before the HOA even existed. He folded the letter neatly, slipped it into a drawer, and went back to his notes on wind velocity. But that night, as he stepped outside, the laughter faded. The lights from the clubhouse glowed across the valley, so bright they washed out the stars, and from his porch he could see figures standing by the fence line, 2 men in polos pointing toward his barn with flashlights, as if surveying it like an obstacle. The next morning, he drove into town to double-check his property records. The clerk at the county office recognized his name and gave him a weary smile before pulling up the digital file. Everything was in order. Parcel 18B, 23 acres, boundaries unchanged since 1989. But as he scanned the map, Blake noticed something subtle. The overlay showing the new development's visual buffer zone extended several meters into his land. When he asked the clerk about it, she frowned and said, "That's strange. That zone's just for planning. It's not supposed to affect ownership lines." Her uncertainty lingered with him on the drive home. That evening, another letter arrived, this time hand-delivered. It was shorter, more personal, written by someone named Christopher Vale, the HOA president. "We understand your attachment to your property," it began, "but community harmony requires compromise. We're prepared to assist in relocating your barn at no expense to you. Please contact us to discuss this opportunity before we escalate the matter." The phrase, "before we escalate," didn't read like an offer. It read like a warning. Blake placed the letter beside the first and sat at the kitchen table, staring at them both. There was a precision in their tone, a kind of sterile confidence that reminded him of contracts written by people who never expected to be challenged. That night, wind roared across the ridge, bending the tall grass until it flattened like waves under invisible pressure. Blake walked to the barn, opened the doors, and stood inside for a long while. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. The wood smelled of old paint and weathered soil. He remembered repairing one of the beams last summer, replacing splintered planks by hand, convinced he was preserving something timeless. Now, Staring at the worn floorboards, he realized how fragile ownership could feel when someone wealthier decided your horizon was in their way. In the following days, he began to notice small changes. Surveyor flags appeared along the ridge, marked in neon orange. A stranger parked his SUV near the boundary line and left tire tracks in the mud, and the maintenance crew from the golf course started trimming weeds several feet past the fence, claiming they were clearing encroaching vegetation. Blake didn't confront them. He simply watched, hands buried in his jacket pockets, the same steady calm he used to measure weather fronts settling now over the chaos building around him. The barn, standing quietly at the crest, had never looked more defiant or more vulnerable. The first real sign that the conflict was no longer about appearances came on a damp Thursday morning when Blake noticed a row of stakes driven deep into the ground near his northern fence. Each stake bore a small white tag printed with numbers and coordinates that meant nothing to him, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had begun a new survey. He called out to the two men working nearby, but they didn't even glance his way. Their truck bore no company name, only a magnetic sticker that read, "Authorized Development Access." When he asked who had given them permission to enter his property, one of them replied with a shrug that it was cleared through the association. Blake's voice sharpened as he told them this wasn't association land, but they kept hammering stakes until he finally walked down to them and physically pulled one out of the dirt. The younger man muttered something under his breath, but the older one just gave him a long, unreadable look, climbed into the truck, and drove off without a word. Blake stood in the mud holding the wooden stake like evidence of trespass, his pulse unsteady, not from anger, but from disbelief at how casually they had treated his ownership as negotiable. That afternoon, a courier arrived with a thick envelope addressed not to him personally, but to current occupant. Inside were photocopies of zoning maps, stamped and signed by the HOA's legal counsel. The letter accompanying them was written in the same polished tone as before, according to updated boundary adjustments authorized by the Clear Ridge Development Committee. A portion of his property had been reclassified as part of the Scenic Corridor Initiative, a legal euphemism for a view protection zone. Buried in the fine print was a phrase that made his stomach twist. Existing non-compliant structures are subject to mandatory relocation or removal. It wasn't a request anymore. It was an official declaration that the barn didn't belong where it stood. He called the county recorder's office immediately, but the clerk who had been so helpful before now sounded distant, careful with her words. She explained that the HOA had filed a supplemental adjustment, citing an old easement dating back to the 1970s, when the property had been part of a larger agricultural tract. Blake had never seen any mention of it in his deeds, and when he asked for a copy, she hesitated before admitting that the document wasn't digitized and would take a few weeks to retrieve. He hung up with a cold knot in his chest, realizing that the longer this dragged on, the easier it would be for them to normalize their narrative. By sunset, he drove to the ridge again and saw something that almost made him laugh from sheer absurdity. A small wooden sign planted just beyond his fence, painted in green and white, reading, "Panorama Estates, Private Scenic Boundary. Please respect property lines." They had placed it on his side of the fence. The implication was clear. Anyone passing by would assume the land already belonged to them. That night his phone buzzed with a new email from Christopher Vale. The message was brief but unsettling in its familiarity. "We understand you may feel unsettled by recent developments. Our team is happy to help you transition smoothly should you decide to relocate your structure. We're even prepared to offer a goodwill compensation for your cooperation." Blake read it twice, noting the way every sentence pretended kindness while erasing his autonomy. He didn't reply. Instead, he forwarded the email to a friend who worked in land administration and asked her to verify the Scenic Corridor Initiative. she wrote back the next morning. There is no such registered program in the county database. The realization hit him with the slow clarity of dread. The HOA wasn't merely stretching the law, they were fabricating their own version of it. He spent the day combing through his documents, pulling out every deed, plat, and tax receipt he'd kept in a metal filing cabinet by the window. The papers confirmed what he already knew. His boundaries were untouched for decades, but against corporate influence and the wealth funneled into the golf course, that proof felt as fragile as paper truly was. Late that evening, as a thin fog settled over the ridge, Blake heard an unfamiliar hum echoing from the valley below. He stepped outside and saw a small drone hovering near the barn, its red light blinking methodically as it scanned the structure before drifting away toward the golf course. He had heard rumors that the HOA used drones to document code violations, but seeing it above his land without permission felt invasive in a way that stirred something deep and defensive in him. He watched until it vanished into the mist, then returned to the kitchen, poured a cup of cold coffee, and tried to calm his thoughts. The logical part of him wanted to believe this would resolve itself once the county confirmed the real boundaries. The rest of him, the part that had grown up understanding how power worked when backed by money, knew better. The next morning, his mailbox held a new envelope, this time from a private law firm representing Panorama Estates. The letter accused him of willful obstruction of community development efforts and warned that continued interference may constitute grounds for legal action. It also mentioned, almost casually, that the HOA had already engaged an appraiser to assess potential compensation in the event of a transfer of ownership. Transfer of ownership. The words rattled in his mind like loose bolts in machinery. He hadn't agreed to anything, hadn't signed a single form, yet they were already speaking as if the land were in negotiation. That night, unable to sleep, he walked the perimeter of his property with a flashlight. The air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and cedar. At the northern line, where the ridge dipped into a shallow gully, he found fresh tire tracks cutting through the mud, stopping right at one of his fence posts. A section of wire had been clipped cleanly and folded back, not torn or bent, cut deliberately. He replaced it in silence, securing the post again, his hands steady despite the tremor beneath the surface of his calm. Whoever had been here hadn't come to vandalize, they had come to measure. The following day, he visited the county courthouse in person. The building smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, and every clerk he spoke to seemed eager to pass him along to someone else. After nearly an hour, he was directed to a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as the liaison for land use disputes. The man's smile was thin, his tone perfectly neutral, as he explained that the reclassification of his property was technically still pending review, meaning there was nothing the county could do until it was finalized. When Blake asked who had initiated the process, the man hesitated before saying, "It was filed by a representative of the HOA's Development Council. They have temporary authority during the review phase." Temporary authority. Another phrase designed to sound harmless while disguising its implications. Blake left the courthouse with the unsettling sense that the law itself was no longer solid ground, but shifting sand beneath his feet. As he drove home, the manicured lawns and white fences of Panorama Estates gleamed in the sun like a mirage of order built on quiet coercion. His barn, standing small and weathered on the ridge, suddenly seemed like an act of rebellion in a landscape engineered to erase individuality. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and shadows stretched long across the valley, Blake received another email from Christopher Vale. It was only one line this time. "The community hopes you'll reconsider before formal proceedings begin." He closed his laptop without replying and stepped out onto the porch. The wind had died, the valley was silent, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of isolation not as peace but as exposure. Somewhere below, Beneath the perfect greens and white fences, people were redrawing the world around him, and no one seemed willing to admit it. By the time the first official notice of hearing arrived, Blake had already stopped expecting logic from anyone connected to the HOA. The document was printed on thick paper, embossed with the Panorama Estate seal, and framed as an invitation to a dialogue. But beneath its diplomatic phrasing lay the same quiet arrogance that had threaded through every letter before it, a reminder that this was no longer a misunderstanding but a campaign, and that his refusal to yield had become personal to someone. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday at the golf club's main building, a gleaming structure of glass and white stone that looked more like a courthouse than a recreation center. He debated ignoring it altogether, but a small voice in the back of his mind warned that silence would only let them shape the narrative in his absence. On the day of the meeting, he drove down the winding road to the valley, parking his pickup between rows of imported sedans. The air smelled faintly of chlorine and cut grass, and as he stepped out, a man in a blazer greeted him with the rehearsed smile of someone used to dealing with dissenters. Inside, the hearing room was bright and clinical, its windows overlooking the very view his barn supposedly obstructed. At the far end of the table sat Christopher Vale, tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore charm like armor. Beside him was a woman Blake recognized from the signatures on the legal letters, the HOA's counsel. Vale gestured to the chair opposite. "Mr. Randolph, thank you for joining us," he said in a tone that managed to sound gracious and condescending at once. "We'd prefer to resolve this amicably." Blake nodded and sat down, saying nothing. A projector hummed to life, displaying aerial photographs of his land, the barn marked with a red outline. Vale began to speak about community aesthetics and shared property values, his words rolling together like a sales pitch rehearsed 100 times. Then he changed slides, showing an image of the same hill without the barn, digitally erased, the horizon seamless and clean. "You see," he said, "how the landscape restores its natural harmony." Blake leaned back in his chair, studying the image. "That's not natural harmony," he said quietly. "That's erasure." The attorney shifted uncomfortably, but Vale's smile didn't waver. "We're not trying to take anything from you, Mr. Randolph. We're simply ensuring that all residents can enjoy the same quality of life. We've even proposed a relocation plan. The barn can be rebuilt at the base of the hill out of sight. You won't have to pay a cent." Blake's answer came slowly, measured. "You built a golf course on land that used to be open forest, and now you're talking to me about preserving the view." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the hum of the projector. Vale finally exhaled through his nose and said, "Let's be clear. You're the only property owner who hasn't cooperated. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The meeting ended without resolution, but as Blake walked back to his truck, he sensed that something had shifted. They were done pretending this was about scenery. That evening, as he sat on his porch nursing a headache, he noticed lights moving across the ridge again, two beams sweeping in parallel arcs like searchlights. He grabbed his binoculars and saw men in reflective vests walking along his fence line. One of them appeared to take photos. Another placed a marker in the soil. He called out, but they were too far to hear. The next morning, new stakes had appeared, this time bright yellow, labeled Survey in Progress. It didn't matter that no official request had been filed. The implication was enough. Someone was claiming authority over his land, one plastic flag at a time. Over the next week, the pressure intensified in small, infuriating ways. The local waste service skipped his pickup twice, citing access issues. His insurance company called to inform him that they had received an anonymous complaint about unsafe structures on the property, prompting a sudden inspection notice. Even the postal carrier, usually friendly, began leaving his mail at the end of the road instead of driving up to the house. It was all minor, plausible, deniable, but together it built a pattern too deliberate to ignore. When he confronted the county about the so-called inspection, the clerk explained that the request had come from a private safety review board connected to community planning. It wasn't illegal, she said, just unusual. Blake started keeping a detailed record of every incident, dates, times, names, even the direction the wind blew on certain days. It wasn't paranoia. It was data, the only kind of defense he trusted. One evening, as he stood by the barn sorting through his notes, a black SUV slowed near the property gate. The tinted window rolled down halfway, and a man inside, bald with the faint accent of someone used to giving orders, called out, "Mr. Randolph, I represent the development's legal interests. We'd like to make one final offer before this becomes more complicated." Blake didn't move. The man continued, "We're prepared to purchase your upper ridge at a generous rate, 5 times the market value. You could keep the lower property, build a new facility there, and we'd handle all the permits." His voice softened, almost kindly. "You'd walk away ahead, Mr. Randolph. This doesn't have to get ugly." Blake stepped closer, his tone steady but sharp. "You're trespassing. Leave." The man studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "We tried." The SUV pulled away, tires whispering against gravel, leaving behind only a faint smell of exhaust and something heavier. Threat. 2 days later, Blake's connection to the county data network, his only line for uploading weather reports, was abruptly disabled. The provider claimed there had been maintenance on the local grid, though every neighbor's service remained untouched. He drove to the nearest service office, waited nearly an hour, and was told that the repair schedule had been filed under developer authorization. When he demanded clarification, the clerk blinked, confused, and admitted that such access shouldn't exist. That night, as he sat in the barn under the flickering beam of a portable lamp, he realized the fight had slipped beyond simple property rights. This was about dominance, about forcing him to acknowledge their reach into every system that surrounded his life. The air grew colder in early November, and with the frost came a kind of uneasy stillness over the valley. Blake spent more time outside, walking the boundaries with his notebook, documenting everything. The barn had become both a landmark and a target, its weathered boards standing as a reminder that someone in the valley refused to yield. One evening, he found a small pile of gravel neatly dumped across his driveway, blocking his truck. There was no note, no signature, just a quiet gesture of control. He cleared it by hand, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Later, as he washed the dirt from his palms, his reflection in the window caught his attention. Tired eyes, unshaven, a face that looked older than it had a month ago. The toll wasn't physical, but psychological, a steady erosion of certainty. Still, he refused to move. If they wanted his land, they would have to prove it on paper, not through intimidation. He began corresponding directly with the county assessor's office, requesting archived documents. A clerk named Mason eventually replied with a cryptic message. "You didn't hear it from me, but check the survey maps from '93. Something was changed back then." Quietly. That clue sent Blake digging through microfilm records at the library, scanning faded blueprints until he found it. The same parcel, but with a notation marking the ridge as reserved for agricultural observation. The line that now defined the golf course's northern edge had been added later, in a different ink. Someone had redrawn history, one pen stroke at a time. When he returned home that night, the lights from Panorama Estates glowed brighter than ever, illuminating the hills in sterile gold. He looked at his barn, its silhouette dark against the glare, and felt a strange mix of anger and awe. They had underestimated him. He wasn't a retiree clinging to nostalgia or a recluse afraid of progress. He was a man who understood systems, and systems could be exposed. The realization steadied him. Whatever game they were playing, he had just found the first crack in its design. For weeks the valley seemed to hold its breath. The frost thickened on the ridges, the golf course grass turned brittle and pale, and the silence between Blake and the association became almost theatrical, as though both sides were waiting for the other to make the next move. He spent his mornings cataloging temperature shifts for the university, though lately no one from the department had called to confirm receipt of his data. The barn remained his sanctuary, a place that still obeyed simple logic and weather rather than bureaucracy. Yet beneath that routine, something had changed in him. Each new letter, each intrusion, had stripped away another layer of the quiet, detached man he thought himself to be. What replaced it wasn't anger exactly, but an alertness, a sharpened attention that made every sound on the property register differently. The crack of a twig, the hum of engines from the valley, even the faint electronic whine that drifted through the night air, everything had become evidence of some larger pattern he was beginning to decipher. One evening, after another futile call with the county about the missing easement file, Blake decided to approach the problem from a different angle. If the HOA had altered the boundaries, there had to be a technical source, a survey, an update request, or a land use model submitted through official channels. He still had contacts in environmental research, and one of them, a data analyst named Rachel Nguyen, owed him a favor. He called her late, explaining only that he needed access to the archived geospatial maps for Clear Ridge County, specifically the development overlays submitted in the last 5 years. There was a long pause before she said quietly, "You're not the first to ask about that area." Her tone was careful, but Blake heard something underneath. Unease, maybe curiosity. "Give me a few days," she added. "Just don't mention my name if anyone asks how you got them." 3 nights later, an email arrived with no subject line and an encrypted attachment. When Blake decrypted the file, he found layered topographical maps with time stamps. The changes were subtle at first. The boundaries of panorama estates expanded in small increments, almost invisible on the yearly updates, until suddenly, in one map dated 18 months ago, a large shaded zone appeared stretching into his property, the exact area of the golf course's western holes. What caught his attention wasn't just the overlay, but the metadata attached to the file. The author field listed a familiar company name, Meridian Land Systems. He'd seen it before, on the side of one of the surveyor trucks that had trespassed months earlier. He cross-referenced the coordinates with his deed, measuring each distance manually, and felt a slow thrill of vindication rise in his chest. If the data was correct, nearly 20% of the golf course, including the luxury clubhouse and maintenance road, was sitting squarely on his legally owned land. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the flickering monitor. The air in the barn felt suddenly heavy, as though the room itself recognized the magnitude of what he'd uncovered. Yet beneath the surge of satisfaction came a more complicated realization. This wasn't just about a stolen hill or an obstructed view. Someone had built a multi-million-dollar facility on land they didn't own, and if that fact ever surfaced, it would detonate like a controlled explosion through the county's politics. The next morning, Blake drove to the registrar's office carrying printed copies of the maps, the deed, and the time-stamped metadata. The clerk on duty, a different woman this time, studied the documents with furrowed brows, then asked him to wait while she consulted her supervisor. He stood in the stale air of the lobby for nearly 20 minutes before a tall man in a suit emerged, introducing himself as Mr. Lowell from the county's legal department. Lowell scanned the documents quickly, his face unreadable, and then said, "Where did you obtain these files?" His tone was polite but guarded, the kind that implied trouble. Blake explained that he had received them from a private consultant for verification. Lowell nodded slowly and replied, "I'm going to need to make a few calls. If what you're showing me is accurate, there are serious implications. but I advise you to keep this between us for now. You don't want to start a storm before we verify the rain." The phrase sounded rehearsed, as if he'd used it before in messier cases. When Blake left the office, a subtle unease followed him. He'd expected skepticism or even dismissal, but Lowell's reaction suggested the opposite, that the county was already aware of irregularities and had chosen not to confront them. Driving home through the pale winter light, he noticed a black sedan trailing him at a distance for several miles before turning off toward the highway. He told himself it was coincidence, yet when he reached his driveway, he waited a full minute before exiting the truck, scanning the ridge for movement. The stillness was intact, but the sense of being observed had become constant, like static in the air. That evening he heard a knock at his door. Standing on the porch was a woman he didn't recognize, bundled in a heavy coat, her expression serious. "Mr. Randolph, my name's Amelia Price. I handle property compliance for Meridian Land Systems." Her presence caught him off guard. He had expected lawyers, or perhaps a courier, not a field representative. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she began, pulling a folder from her bag. "I'd like to clarify some details about the surveys conducted near your boundary." Blake motioned for her to step inside, though every instinct told him this wasn't a courtesy visit. She laid out papers across the kitchen table, technical diagrams filled with coordinates and signatures. "You see here," she said, tracing a line with her pen. "This section was adjusted during environmental mitigation. It wasn't a seizure, just a correction to match the natural drainage basin." Her tone was confident, almost gentle, as if explaining something to a child. Blake let her finish, then opened his own folder and slid across the map with the time-stamped metadata. "This adjustment," he said evenly, "is dated 18 months before your supposed mitigation, and the author field lists your company." For a brief second, the mask slipped. Her eyes flicked to the map, then to him, measuring how much he knew. "Where did you get that?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of its professional polish. "That doesn't matter," Blake replied. "What matters is that your company redrew the line without consent or record." The silence stretched between them until she finally gathered her papers and said, "You don't understand how big this is. It's not just HOA politics. There are investors, contracts. If you start pushing, they'll push back harder." She looked genuinely unsettled, as if realizing she'd said too much. When she left, Blake watched her taillights disappear down the hill, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he felt the full weight of the machinery he was standing against. The next few days blurred together in a fog of waiting. He half expected a visit from county officials or even law enforcement, but none came. Instead, strange minor disturbances began again. The electricity flickered during calm weather. His weather data transmitter went offline for 48 hours, and when he checked the logs, an unauthorized login had modified the transmission path. At night, he started hearing faint mechanical clicks outside near the barn, though whenever he investigated, there was nothing but the sound of wind through the trees. One morning, he found a small metallic tag embedded in the ground near his fence, an RFID marker, the kind used for underground mapping. Someone was still scanning his land, still acting as though ownership was theirs to define. Then came the email from Rachel. It was short and urgent. "Be careful. Meridian's contract with the HOA isn't just about land. They're developing data infrastructure across private parcels, fiber lines, sensors, control nodes. Your ridge is part of the network. They can't admit it without risking everything." Blake reread the message 3 times, the implications settling slowly like sediment in his mind. The barn wasn't obstructing a view. It was sitting atop a critical line of infrastructure that shouldn't legally exist. They hadn't come for his land because it was beautiful, but because it was strategic. The phrase community harmony had been camouflage for something industrial and hidden beneath the surface. That night, he climbed the ridge under a moonless sky, flashlight in hand, and began to dig where he had found the marker. After an hour of effort, his shovel hit metal. A conduit, smooth and new, buried shallowly beneath the soil. When he brushed away the dirt, he saw the faint logo stamped on the side, Meridian Land Systems. The pipe ran parallel to his fence, turning toward the golf course. He followed it for several meters before the ground dipped too steeply, the beam of his flashlight catching only frost and shadow. The truth lay right there, tangible and cold under his fingertips. They had built their empire across his property, betting that he would either sell, surrender, or vanish quietly under the pressure. As he stood at the edge of the ridge, wind tearing through the trees, Blake felt something settle inside him. Not fear, not even fury, but a grim certainty. They had stolen from him in daylight and hidden it beneath the language of legality. Now, armed with proof buried in his own soil, he understood that his fight wasn't about preserving a view or even defending a building. It was about forcing the truth into the open, no matter what it cost him. The valley below glimmered with artificial light, serene and ordered, and for the first time he saw it for what it really was. Not a community, but a facade stretched across stolen ground. The first strike came quietly, without warning or spectacle. One morning, Blake found a bright orange notice taped to his front door, stamped with the HOA emblem and a series of fine print citations that seemed to stretch for pages. It accused him of obstruction of infrastructural maintenance, unauthorized excavation, and endangering community assets. The notice carried a fine totaling $24,000, payable within 30 days, and included a line in smaller font that chilled him more than the amount itself. Failure to comply may result in repossession or forfeiture of property in accordance with Local Code 17B. He reread the line 3 times before it registered. The association was now threatening to seize his land entirely. The irony was grotesque. They had built illegal infrastructure under his property and now claimed he was endangering it by discovering it. He folded the notice, slipped it into a folder already thick with documents, and stood for a long time by the barn window, watching the valley below as the wind combed through the pale grass. The horizon no longer looked like landscape. It looked like a battlefield where one side fought with silence and paperwork. Later that day, a message from the county assessor's office arrived in his inbox, curt and official. Following recent allegations of code violations, your property has been placed under temporary audit. No sale, lease, or transfer is permitted until the review concludes. Blake exhaled slowly, realizing the depth of their coordination. They weren't using bulldozers or lawsuits yet. They were isolating him through procedural chokeholds, cutting off every avenue of defense one bureaucratic knot at a time. He drove into town and requested a meeting with the assessor, a middle-aged man named Collins who had the nervous politeness of someone used to walking on bureaucratic eggshells. Collins adjusted his glasses and spoke in measured tones. "Look, Mr. Randolph, this isn't personal. The HOA has influence here. They fund a lot of community development, and when they raise a complaint, the county is obligated to review it." Blake's response was quiet but sharp. "And when the complaint is based on falsified data?" Collins flinched as if struck, glancing toward the frosted glass wall before leaning forward. "If you have evidence of tampering, bring it formally. But off the record, be careful. People have lost more than land over this kind of thing." The next morning, the hum of an engine woke him before dawn. He stepped outside to find a truck idling near his gate, its hazard lights blinking in the dark. 2 men in reflective jackets were unloading equipment, tripods, scanners, and a small generator. "You're on private property," Blake called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. One of the men straightened, his tone dismissive. "We're conducting an emergency inspection on behalf of the HOA. You'll need to step aside." Blake walked down the slope until he stood between them and the barn. "You'll need a warrant," he said. The younger man smirked and held up a document in a plastic sleeve, but Blake saw immediately that it bore no court seal, only the HOA logo. "That's not legal authority," he said. "You touch anything on this property, and I'll call the sheriff myself." The men exchanged a glance, muttered something about non-compliance, and packed their equipment. As they drove away, Blake snapped a photo of the license plate, an instinctive act of defense. 2 hours later, his internet connection went down again, this time accompanied by a call from his provider informing him that his service had been temporarily suspended pending verification of account ownership. For several days, he lived in near silence, cut off from digital communication. The isolation was both a strategy and a message. They wanted him to understand how small one person could feel when systems stopped acknowledging his existence. When he finally managed to restore his network through a mobile hotspot, he discovered that his university contract had been terminated. The email was sterile, unsigned. "Due to administrative restructuring, your external data services are no longer required." It wasn't difficult to guess who had made the call. For the first time since the conflict began, exhaustion replaced anger. He sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents that once represented proof, but now felt like relics of a logic that no longer applied. The barn creaked under a gust of wind, the sound almost human in its weariness. That night, headlights flashed briefly at the far edge of his property. Blake turned off his lamp and watched from the window as a car idled near the old oak for several minutes before reversing and disappearing into the dark. The next morning, a large envelope had been shoved under his door. Inside was a single page with no header, no signature, only a typed message. "Walk away. You're outnumbered, and no one's on your side." The absence of explicit threat made it worse. It wasn't bravado. It was confidence, the voice of someone who knew exactly how power worked. Blake burned the page in the fireplace, watching the words curl into ash, and understood that this was no longer just corporate coercion. It was psychological warfare. He began documenting everything not just for evidence, but for survival, building a timeline with cross-referenced notes, photographs, and copies stored off-site. The act of recording grounded him, reminding him that the truth existed even if no one wanted to see it. But the pressure continued to mount. A week later, he received an email from a law firm he'd never contacted, offering negotiation services for distressed landowners. The message contained details only the HOA or county would know. It was bait disguised as help. He deleted it and drove to the courthouse the next day, intending to file a formal complaint. Yet before he reached the clerk's counter, a deputy intercepted him, explaining politely that the office was temporarily closed to external filings due to a network breach. Blake almost laughed at the absurdity. They didn't even bother hiding their coordination anymore. When he returned home, he found that someone had entered the property again. Small boot prints in the frost leading up to the barn door. Inside, nothing was taken, but one of his drawers had been left slightly open, and his printed maps were stacked differently than he remembered. He checked his camera system, only to discover that the footage from the last 48 hours was corrupted. The timestamp froze at 2:17 a.m., the exact hour he'd heard distant metallic noises 2 nights earlier. A strange calm settled over him then, not the calm of defeat, but of absolute clarity. They could erase files, twist records, even bury evidence, but they couldn't change the physical truth of what lay beneath the ground. He walked outside, the cold biting through his jacket, and looked toward the slope where the hidden conduit ran. Somewhere under that soil was the one piece of evidence that would break their illusion of ownership. The proof they couldn't manipulate without destroying themselves. In the following days, Blake contacted the county environmental department under the guise of reporting a possible contamination leak. He described the conduit in technical terms, careful not to mention the HOA by name. Bureaucracy, for all its flaws, had one virtue. It hated unregistered infrastructure. Within a week, he received confirmation that an inspection team would be dispatched. It was a small victory, but a real one. The moment he hung up the phone, a strange mix of relief and apprehension coursed through him. He knew they would find something, and when they did, the line between accusation and proof would vanish. Yet he also knew that exposing the truth would push his enemies to their most desperate measures. The night before the inspection, he stood at the edge of the ridge under a pale, colorless sky. The valley glowed below, serene and deceptive, the golf course lights reflecting off the frozen ponds like pieces of broken glass. Somewhere down there, people were sitting in warm rooms, drafting new ways to silence him, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that the ground beneath them was already cracking. He thought of his father, who had once told him that the most dangerous men were the ones who believed they were righteous. Blake smiled faintly at the memory, the cold air biting at his skin, and whispered to the darkness, "Let's see how righteous they are when the dirt starts talking." The inspection began on a gray morning that smelled of rain and tension. 3 county officials arrived in a white van with the seal of the Environmental Oversight Division stenciled on the side. They introduced themselves briefly, their voices clipped and professional, but Blake could sense their caution, the way they kept glancing toward the manicured valley below, as though aware that every movement here was being watched. He guided them to the ridge where the metallic conduit lay buried and stood aside as they unpacked their equipment. The lead inspector, a broad-shouldered woman named Harris, took soil readings while the others used a ground-penetrating sensor to trace the length of the buried structure. Within minutes, the display began to map a clear metallic line that extended well beyond Blake's property and deep into the golf course. One of the inspectors frowned and said, almost to himself, "This isn't irrigation, this is fiber infrastructure." Harris looked up sharply. "Fiber for what?" he asked. The man hesitated. "Data transmission, private network capacity." Her jaw tightened. "Private, as in unregistered." The silence that followed was confirmation enough. Blake watched as they continued the scan, the line growing more complex with each meter, splitting into branches that formed a web beneath the soil. The reality of it was both thrilling and horrifying. The HOA, through Meridian Land Systems, had buried a high-capacity communications grid across multiple private properties without disclosure, using the language of community development to mask what was essentially a covert expansion project. It explained everything. The relentless push for his land, the falsified maps, the intimidation. His barn wasn't a nuisance. It was a barrier sitting directly over the main node of their illegal network. He had stumbled into the kind of secret that corporations spent fortunes to keep buried, and now the evidence was in the hands of county officials who, by law, were required to report it. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel something like relief. The truth was no longer just his burden. But relief is fragile, and by the time the inspectors packed their gear, that feeling had already begun to curdle into apprehension. Harris assured him that a formal report would be filed within 48 hours and that the county would issue a temporary injunction against any further activity on the site. She gave him her card, her eyes meeting his with a look that carried both respect and concern. "You've done the right thing, Mr. Randolph, but be careful who you talk to about this until it's official." He thanked her and watched the van disappear down the winding road. The quiet that followed felt unnatural, heavy, as though the land itself was waiting for a reaction. That night, the rain finally came. Sheets of water blurred the valley lights into streaks of white and gold. Blake stayed awake, unable to shake the sense that something was coming. Around midnight, the sound of tires crunching on wet gravel pulled him to the window. Headlights cut through the rain, stopping just beyond his gate. He saw silhouettes, 3 figures stepping out, their shapes distorted by the downpour. One of them carried a flashlight that swept across the fence, then toward the barn. Blake's heartbeat slowed, steady and deliberate. He reached for his phone and began recording from the darkened window, narrating the time and description in a low whisper. The men moved with the practiced precision of people following orders, unbothered by the storm. When one of them pried open the gate latch, Blake stepped outside, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "You're trespassing," he called out. The flashlight froze, then turned toward him, blinding him momentarily. A familiar voice spoke above the hiss of rain. Smooth, composed, unmistakably Christopher Vale's. "Mr. Randolph, this is unnecessary. We're here to ensure the safety of our property." Blake's laughter cut through the storm, bitter and sharp. "Your property? You built your empire on mine." Vale took a step forward, his coat soaked but his composure unbroken. "Let's not be melodramatic. You've made a mistake bringing outsiders into this. The county doesn't understand the agreements in place, and when they do, you'll be the one facing penalties. I came tonight to offer you a solution. Sell the ridge, quietly, before this turns ugly for everyone." His words were calm, but his eyes betrayed urgency. Blake didn't move. "You buried illegal infrastructure across half the county. There's a report being filed right now that will make that public." Vale's expression shifted, just slightly, the faintest crack in his polished demeanor. "Then I hope, for your sake, that report doesn't get misplaced." Behind him, one of the men opened the truck bed, revealing metal tools, shovels, cutting blades, heavy-duty tarps. Blake realized with sudden clarity that they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to remove the evidence before the county could return. He stepped back slowly, calculating distance and options. The barn loomed behind him, a dark shape against the storm. "If you cross that fence," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, "you'll prove everything I've claimed." Vale gave a thin smile. "No one's watching, Mr. Randolph. Not tonight." The words had barely left his mouth when headlights appeared at the base of the hill, 2 vehicles climbing the road, their beams slicing through the rain. Vale's men froze, uncertain. Within moments, the white van from the county pulled up beside the gate. Harris stepped out, raincoat flapping, a camera in hand. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice amplified by the storm. "Care to explain why you're tampering with an active investigation site?" The silence that followed was electric. Vale's charm evaporated. He turned toward her, still trying for composure, but Harris was already lifting her camera. "Step away from the fence," she ordered. "This is county property until our report is complete." One of her colleagues approached the buried conduit, shining a light that reflected off the exposed metal where Vale's men had begun to dig. Harris photographed it all. The tools, the truck, the unauthorized personnel. "You just turned a zoning dispute into a criminal investigation," she said coldly. Vale didn't answer. He signaled to his men, who began retreating toward the truck, muttering curses under their breath. The vehicles disappeared into the storm, leaving deep ruts in the mud. When they were gone, Harris turned to Blake, her expression both grim and resolute. "We'll need your testimony first thing tomorrow. This goes beyond local jurisdiction now." She placed a gloved hand on his shoulder. "You're going to want to stay somewhere else tonight, just until things settle." He nodded, exhaustion washing through him like the rain itself. As she and her team documented the last of the site, Blake stood by the barn, the wind whipping against him, the horizon flashing with distant lightning. For months, the HOA had tried to bury him under fear, under paperwork, under silence, but now, in the glare of storm and law and truth, their power finally looked as fragile as the structures they built. The barn, battered but unbroken, stood behind him like a witness, and for the first time, the valley felt like his again. By the time the sun rose over the ridge, the storm had passed, leaving the valley washed clean and strangely quiet. The next 48 hours moved in a blur of statements, signatures, and phone calls that never seemed to end. Harris's report triggered an immediate suspension of the HOA's operating license and a county injunction freezing all development across Panorama Estates. News spread faster than anyone expected, first through official channels, then through whispers and forwarded emails. By the end of the week, the scandal had a name: the Meridian Corridor case. For the residents, it was a revelation. For the developers, a disaster. Investigators confirmed that miles of fiber infrastructure had been laid illegally across private properties, their permits falsified, and their records rewritten. The HOA board resigned in a single afternoon, their final statement a hollow attempt at damage control. Blake sat in the courthouse on the day the settlement was finalized, his hands clasped together as the judge read the decision aloud. The ruling was clear: full restitution of property rights, immediate removal of all unlicensed equipment, and financial compensation for every homeowner affected, his claim alone valued higher than the cost of the entire golf course extension. Vail did not appear in court. Rumor had it he had already left the state. When the gavel fell, Blake felt neither triumph nor relief, only a quiet exhaustion that ran deeper than anger. Justice, when it finally arrived, came not as a blaze but as a slow uncoiling, a long exhale after months of holding his breath. Weeks later, as spring thawed the ground, heavy machines rolled into the valley, not to build but to dismantle. Crews tore up the illegal conduits, unspooled the hidden cables, and left the soil bare again. The golf course closed indefinitely, its fairways growing wild and uneven. Blake watched from his porch as the last trucks departed, their tracks cutting deep into the soft earth. The barn stood unchanged, weathered but defiant, its red boards glinting faintly in the evening light. It had outlasted everything built to erase it. He didn't sell the land, though offers poured in from firms eager to rehabilitate the area. Instead, he restored the ridge to what it had been, a working research site, modest and solitary, untouched by corporate promises. Some nights, when the wind carried faint echoes from the empty valley, he imagined hearing the soft thud of golf balls, a phantom memory of what greed had built and nature reclaimed. The silence that followed was not lonely, but earned. And when visitors occasionally stopped by, asking about the view, he would smile and say, "It looks better when you know who it belongs to."